Life is a fast-paced and nonsensical thing. No matter how much we try to make sense of it, life always seems to veer off script. It somehow gets around our attempts to logically and rationally understand it. Just when we think we have it all figured out, life throws us a curveball that calls our entire world into question. And the more we attempt to contain the workings of our life, the more it pushes back against us. This is a relatively common experience. One of the latest displays of how nonsensical life can be was the pandemic. Everything was more or less okay going into Christmas in 2019. And then suddenly things weren't okay anymore. The World Health Organization estimates that around 3 million people died from the virus. Some of us lost friends or family members during that terrible time. And perhaps some of us sat back and asked, what the hell is the purpose of this? That's a completely valid question. But a generation before us would probably have said something similar about the development and detonation of the nuclear bomb. We are still, and perhaps always will, labor under the dark cloud of that invention. What's the purpose of human life if it can just be blown to smithereens in a few seconds? The millions of years of evolutionary refining could be ended just like that, in a matter of moments. And several generations back would say something similar about the bubonic plague that ripped through Europe in the 14th century. The bubonic plague is believed to have killed between 25 and 50 million people in just a few years. What's the meaning of that? What's the purpose of such a strange and fragile life? Human history is littered with moments just like this. Our relatively stable life is constantly upended by ridiculous events we couldn't possibly anticipate. This inability to make sense of the world is what Albert Camus referred to as the absurd. So, what exactly is the absurd? Camus said that the absurd comes about by the confrontation between the human need for meaning and the unreasonable silence and indifference of the world. When we discover that the world doesn't play by the rules of logic or reason, mental cramps start to creep in. How can it be that our consciousness, that part of us that desires meaning and purpose, can exist in a world that lacks any objective meaning or purpose? We may ask ourselves, what's the point of going to school and trying to get a good job if I could die in a car crash tomorrow? What's the point of asking that really cute girl out if I could be diagnosed with a malignant disease just hours after doing so? For Camus, these are reasonable questions to ask. The web of the absurd can sometimes fill us with existential paralysis, where we don't know how to proceed through the world since nothing ultimately matters. After all, we're all going to die one day. Everything we love and desire and value will ultimately fizzle like a candle in the wind. Camus understood that those of us who were confronted with the absurd would try to get out of it as fast as we could. And in his philosophical essay entitled The Myth of Sisyphus, he lays out two common responses we often make when presented with the absurd. The first is physical suicide, and the second is philosophical suicide. The essay famously begins, "There is but one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide." The first kind of suicide is physical suicide. Some of us realize that there's no ultimate meaning to the world, and so it may seem reasonable to just kill ourselves. What's the point of living, knowing full well we're going to die in the end anyway? While this is a fair point, Camus found several issues with those who thought physical suicide was a proper response to the absurd. The first is that committing suicide doesn't somehow solve the absurd. In fact, Camus believed that to commit suicide was just another instance of absurdity. To commit suicide would also be a confession that we no longer want our freedom, our ability to navigate the world on our own terms. And freedom for Camus was among the most valuable jewels in humanity's arsenal. And it'd be absurd to surrender the only thing of real value to the human experience. The second response to the absurd is philosophical suicide. Another term for philosophical suicide is taking a leap of faith. Camus' view here is that when faced with the absurd, many of us wish to neutralize it by fleeing to something that gives our life objective meaning and purpose. The most common manifestation of philosophical suicide is religion. A leap of faith often comes with the assurance that death is not really death at all, but life in another form. Religion can act as a numbing agent against the lupine howl of despair. But Camus believed that appealing to religion amounted to putting our head in the sand. Camus once said that man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. Part of what the French Algerian meant here is that we constantly try to punch our way out of our mortal condition. We don't want to embrace our nature. We want something else, something better, something more than is possible. So, if suicide and religion are no longer options, how the hell are we supposed to carry on with our fast-paced and nonsensical life? It's simple. We embrace the absurd. But what does an absurd life look like? Once we understand that there's no objective meaning in the world, once we understand a divine entity isn't going to swoop down and save us from all of life's horrors, we are free to create our own meaning. Camus believed our best attempt at producing meaning in our lives is to live life to the fullest, for the very limited time we have here. Love those you love with all you've got. Find the things in life that bring you joy, whether that's books, astronomy, knitting, or making YouTube videos, and do those things to the very best of your ability. After Camus came down with a serious bout of tuberculosis at the age of 17, an illness that would plague him his entire life, he lived life as hard as he possibly could in spite of his illness. And now he has extended that same invitation to us, to live while we're alive. Sisyphus was forced to roll a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll down the other side. And then he was to retrieve the boulder and do the same thing again and again for eternity. This obviously isn't a fun activity to be doing for all time, at least on the surface. But Camus suggests that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. In other words, we must imagine that deep down, within the wellspring of Sisyphus's mind, he has formed a meaningful and happy relationship with the boulder. The same goes for you, and the same goes for me. The only reasonable thing to do in an absurd world is to march forward through existence, Leonidas-like, watching the sky darken with the arrows of life, knowing full well that we're not going to make it out of this thing alive.